Welcome to the Artful Teaching Podcast. I'm Cally Flox, today's host, and I have been joined by three incredible women who are working hard on the Native American Curriculum Initiative within the BYU Arts Partnership. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Brenda, why don't you go first?
Hello, it's good to be with you, Cally. My name is Brenda Beyal, and I have to introduce myself in my traditional way. Yat e she'eya Brenda Beyal and shia ashihen shlokia ani bashichin to'achane e dashiche to'achet lini e dashamasane eya wat asan shle. I just introduced myself in Navajo and letting you know that I am born into the Salt clan and born for the Taurine House people. And I am the program coordinator for the Native American Curriculum Initiative.
So I'm Stephanie West, and I'm an instructional designer, and I'm working on a professional development course that is going to accompany the tribal approved lesson plans that the Native American Curriculum Initiative have created.
Stephanie, is that course offered? How is that course offered?
So currently it's not offered. It's still in production. So we're still working on it. But
is it in person or online?
It's going to be an asynchronous course, which means that it will be online, but there won't be synchronous portions. It will mean like not a Zoom session. It will be at your own pace. Teachers can take it and do it when they have the time to do it. That's kind of been our goal.
I'm so excited.
Me too.
Hi, I'm Heather Sundahl, and I am a writer and editor with the Native American Curriculum Initiative, and I just do whatever's needed.
Heather, how many op-eds have you written for us this year?
I don't know, 3, maybe?
4.
4.
There have been 4, and they're incredible. You've done a great job helping us get the word out about this initiative. We have an email newsletter that goes out to about 50 people who've specifically asked for updates about this initiative, tribal members, state representatives, university representatives, and you've been key at keeping people informed on what's happening when. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I just feel like the stuff that we do is so exciting that it needs to go beyond the education realm, and that the general public needs to know about it, get on board, all these issues. If you live in the state of Utah, then these things matter. These are your tribes as well.
And we hope that what we model in the state of Utah can inspire people from around the country to begin conversations in their own areas where you're asking questions and practicing deep listening. I've been so respectful of how you members of this team have really followed those protocols, and you're really telling that story. Now, we put these stories out on our BYU Arts Partnership newsletter as well, but if any listeners would like to be on that more specific newsletter that really targets the leadership in this initiative, we can add you to that newsletter as well. You know, there have been some really complicated conversations that we've all been in since this began, and definitions of words become a really important part of our communicating. Some of these words are so confusing. For example, some of our hardest conversations have been around the word sovereignty. What does it mean to be a sovereign nation? How can we talk about tribal groups versus tribal nations versus sovereign nations? These are complicated terms. First of all, before we get to that, let's just decide how many tribes there are in Utah. Brenda, would you answer that question for us?
Yes, well, we have to decide what we mean by tribes. There are 5 tribal groups, but within those tribal groups, there are 8 sovereign nations. A sovereign nation, to me, and we are all still learning. We're still gathering more information and trying to get a deeper understanding of the word. Sovereign nation means that it is a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. And Native American tribes are unique in that they have that kind of relationship with the federal government. And that stems all the way back to treaties that were signed many, many years ago. There aren't any treaties signed anymore because of different laws and resolutions that have been enacted. And there have been, so I would say sovereign to me, or sovereignty, is having the ability to self-govern to a certain extent, much like states self-govern themselves.
Yeah, so I'd like to it's interesting because we use the word sovereignty, And I think sometimes we use it in place of federally recognized. We had an interesting conversation with James Toledo, who is part of the State Division of Indian Affairs here in Utah. And he made an interesting comment, and this was the first time it really clicked in my mind that sovereignty actually even exceeds what we think of it in this way for these different 8 nations, native nations here in Utah. But sovereignty is something that has existed even before the United States was formed. So these different groups, they had sovereignty. They were able to the term I'm trying to describe this, but sovereignty meaning to manage their own affairs, to have their own form of government. That happened for years and years and years before colonizers even came to the United States. So there was sovereignty that existed for many of these native indigenous groups before the United States was formed. However, once colonizers came here to the United States, then there had to be a way for them to interact. And whomever had the greater power or influence at that time kind of defined that relationship in different ways. First, it was the British and other groups. There was the Spanish and the French, but mostly we'll focus on the British. But then there were also the United States once they won basically the Revolutionary War against the British and then formed the United States government. So it started out as kind of with the British, their policy was that they would recognize them as a foreign nation. That's how they started out. And that's how we ended up with these different treaties, right? But later on, once the United States was formed, as more and more people, more colonizers, especially European colonizers, came here to the United States, or to, at that time, the United States, then the government realized that they were trying to manage conflicts between different colonizers that came and the native groups that were there. And so then there were some different things that happened, court cases that decided and changed that definition of how they interacted together. Now I'm getting into a lot of different stuff, but...
So I want to push back just a little bit on this because I feel like it's not necessarily sovereignty. It feels like a quasi-sovereignty to me. We say it's like a nation-to-nation relationship, but Brenda, if I go as a white lady on the Navajo reservation and I commit a crime, I can't be prosecuted within your courts. And I can't be extradited to the Navajo Nation to stand trial and be accountable for what I've done. And so in that sense, in a lot of these really where the rubber hits the road and in these legal sense, it's not sovereignty. It's not full sovereignty. It's more like a state. It's less of a nation.
I think that sovereignty has many layers to it. I don't think that that there can be a blanket definition for every sovereign nation, Indian tribe here in the United States. Now, sovereignty for us, you're right, Stephanie. I love that you bring that up because so often we feel like history starts with colonizers. And that's not true. And that order and government and having laws begins when white people step foot onto this land, but that's not true. Even before that, there were government entities run in the way that particular tribe wanted things to happen. And so, Heather, you're right, but there are laws that are being changed. There are new ways of looking at sovereignty now, so there is some pushback even within government entities that will allow for prosecution of people who are not within, that are not members of that tribe. I mean, there are some places where if I'm a Navajo and I commit a crime on the Wind River Reservation, I cannot be prosecuted. And so those are different layers of sovereignty or policies that are hopefully being fixed.
This is wonderful information and so much detail. I can tell why we get so excited and can go so deep. Let's come back and just let our listeners know who our tribes are by name. We have 5 groups of tribes who have been created into 8 sovereign nations. Brenda, can you tell us about that?
Yes, I can tell you about that. But Cally, you have a wonderful way of talking about it also. And so maybe you and I should do this together.
So I have to admit that, I'm the one who has the hardest time memorizing these. And So one day somebody asked me, what are the 5 tribes? And I couldn't answer the question. So I swore that would never happen again. So I took the first letter of each tribe, and the only word I could come up with was S-U-N-G-P, Sung P. Okay? So the S stands for the Shoshone, U stands for the Ute, N stands for the Navajo, and G stands for the Goshute, and P is the Paiute. So that gives me my 5 tribes. I remember that the Navajo and Shoshone want to be called nations, and the others, the Goshute, Ute, and Paiute, want to be called tribes. These 3 groups have 2 sovereign nations each. So let's do the math. If the Goshute, Ute, and Paiute tribes have 2 sovereign nations each, that makes 6 total nations. Add the Shoshone Nation and the Navajo Nation, and that makes 8 sovereign nations in Utah.
So the 8 sovereign nations are, in the northernmost part of the state, is the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. And then we have the 2 Ute tribes. There is the Ute Indian tribe of Utah and the Ute Mountain Ute that are down in the southern part by Colorado. And then you have the Goshute. The Goshute also have 2 sovereign nations, or 2 tribal nations. There is the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute and the Skull Valley Band of the Goshute. And then you have the Paiute, and there are 2 tribal nations for the Paiute. You have the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, and you have the Southern Paiute tribe, and then you have the Navajo Nation. And I think it's interesting that some of them like to be called tribe and some of them prefer nation. The northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation and the Navajo Nation, your little finger and your thumb, like to be called nation, and the 3 in the middle are tribes. They prefer the word tribes.
And then tell me how it's distinguished when you have a tribe, a single tribe, and some are groups of tribes. What's a tribal group compared to a tribe?
A tribal group would be, let's take the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah. The Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, there are many tribal nations or sovereign nations within tribal groups. You have the Southern Paiute, you have Northern Paiute, you have Paiute in Nevada, you have Paiute in California. So you have a tribal group would be a bigger group. Then you have the tribal nation, and then within those tribal nations, you may even have bands. Like the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, they have 5 tribal bands. They are the Cedar, Indian Peaks, Kanash, Kusharam, and Shivwits. And they all banded together to form the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah. They have an interesting history because before 1954, they all were tribally recognized. And then each one of them lost their recognition because of policies, and they had to band together to become the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah to all be recognized in about, I think it was 1980.
We all love our family history and our stories. And to hear these stories of how these groups of people survived through hundreds of years and how they had to band together sometimes and find their independence other times, and how they were sometimes fighting each other and sometimes working together, their stories get really complicated. Now, according to Google, it says that there's 574 sovereign nations across the United States right now, and 8 of those are in Utah. Are there other tribes who don't have sovereign recognition?
Yeah, in Utah. So you may have heard the word Timpanogos. It's a mountain, it's a school, it's, all these things. It's a common word that we use here, but it's also a tribe. And they are actively seeking to be federally recognized. And I think it's a struggle. I think it's a really hard thing. There are very elaborate rules, and it can take decades. And in the United States right now, there are over 200 tribes who are trying to get sovereignty, who are trying to be federally recognized.
And what leaves those people vulnerable who are in tribes that are not recognized at this point? What are some of the challenges they deal with? Why is sovereignty important?
Well, Brenda can probably speak more to this, but there's all sorts of resources. There are things that, as a federally recognized tribe, you have access to. I mean, like we talked before, you have the right to decide who's a member of your tribe. I mean, you have, and you're in charge of your own governance. And there are also funds and things that are available.
Like perhaps scholarships for certain people that are from a tribal nation, and if they don't have sovereignty, they might not be able to apply for those kinds of things?
Yes, but it goes deeper than that. I feel like it is a sense of reclamation and recognition that there have been treaties signed in the late 1700s to the late 1800s that the federal government needs to honor. And I feel strongly that it is the responsibility of a nation who came on to sovereign nations to do some sense of restitution for coming onto people who were civilized and who were already here.
So, Brenda, when I was looking into this, what I found that was really interesting and also very sad is that it seems like there's a finite amount of resources that can be allocated to these sovereign nations. And so if another tribe is recognized in Utah, I think it means that there will be less resources for the ones that are already established. And so there seems to be a little bit of tension and resistance between the tribes that are already federally recognized and the ones who are seeking it because of a finite amount of resources.
I have to say that I don't know. And we need to cross that bridge when we come to it, because I am speaking from a Native perspective and I guess a Native heart, in the sense that I feel like there cannot be a finite amount of resources, and that the federal government or state governments need to move things around so that there are enough resources to federally recognize people whose land has been taken from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Let me quickly address the flag here in Utah, because I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, because people are already confused. There's 5 tribes, but there's 8 nations. Like, what's the difference? What's the bottom line? And when you look at the flag in Utah, there's an eagle that has 6 arrows in its beak, and they're said to represent the 6 tribes of Utah. So you're like, wait, I thought it was just like a fight between 5 and 8. Now we're throwing in 6. What's all this about? So I had to do some research, because inquiring minds need to know. And when the flag was created in the 19th century, there were in fact 6 tribes. So in addition to the ones that Brenda has already mentioned, there was the Bannock tribe that was later relocated to southern Idaho. But our flag then is confusing because it reflects something from many years ago that's no longer accurate. And I think they're in the process of redoing the flag. And I'm really curious if they're going to retain something, because I would like the flag to have something that represents the Native tribes.
At the Governor's Native American Summit, they had an entire session on the redesign of the Utah state flag, which gave me a lot of hope that they are acknowledging the Native voice in the redesign of the flag.
That is very good to hear. And it'll be nice if we can get that sorted out, because, 5, 6, 8.
My understanding is they're going to be designing that flag over the next year, and we'll find out. But I know that they are aware of the issue and hopefully being responsive.
I want to touch back on treaties and how Native Americans are able to access maybe funds. I don't want to leave the impression that Native Americans get free things, that the scholarships that they may receive, or we may get health care. That health care or that scholarship is treaty money. It is money that was allocated by the federal government. It comes at a price, It has come at a great price to Native American people. And so I know that there are lots of people out there who think, well, Native Americans get this free and they get this free. That's not true. There are a lot of loopholes. And as far as health care goes, I can personally say that our health care sometimes is D-level health care. And it is not always as rosy as sometimes think. It's not as free as people think it is. It's come with a price.
I think that's a really important point. Some people say people with federal or state jobs and they earn a pension over their whole career. And I've had friends say, yeah, but they're getting all that free money. No, that's negotiated into the salary. Yes. And this is the comparison. This is funding that was negotiated into a treaty that was awarded to these people as a compromise for the land. And previously negotiated funding is not a gift. No. It was probably negotiated with hard lines and probably under-negotiated when it was very first awarded for whatever the exchange was at the time of the negotiation. So, boy, Brenda, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that because in some of the research that I've done, in fact, this summer I attended a professional development course at the University of Utah taught by Dr. Elizabeth Kronk-Warner, who is the Dean of the University of Utah Law School and also a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of the Chippewa Indians. In that professional development, she talked about the history of abrogation is what it's called, which is the modification of treaties over time. And there's a time period where, and a law case that went to the Supreme Court where it was decided that Congress had plenary power or absolute power over treaties. And in that case, basically, they decided that Congress could modify a treaty, they could change a treaty without the acceptance of a Native American tribe or a federally recognized nation. And so there were many things that happened over time. And this was interesting as she asked the question. She said, how many treaties over time have been abrogated, Native American treaties? The answer was all of them. Every single Native American treaty has been abrogated, has been changed over time. And so there were times where Native Americans, without their consent, there were treaties where there were land swaps that took place. There were treaties where money was exchanged in exchange for land. However, there were many times where previous treaties were not honored and were changed, where they were forced to lose their land. There was a period of time where the federal government, taking the role of a protective father or protective government, this was a time period where they viewed Native Americans not as a foreign entity, but as a domestic dependent nation. They then went, and this was the allotment period where they went through and said it was better for Native American groups, instead of recognizing them as a cultural group that held land or that had land held for them as a group. Instead, they said, we're going to give each individual in the tribal group a piece of land. And what it resulted in was the fracturing of the land because they were not there. It was also an attempt to assimilate them into our culture, the European culture, and land ownership was supposed to be viewed in that way. And this was the same time period where many Native American children were sent off to boarding schools because they felt that it would be better for them to assimilate into society. And in the end, it was a huge failure. That was the exact words of Dean Kronk-Warner. It was a huge failure.
I was going to say, if you take a look at Indian history, there are different time periods. There's the extinction period where the federal government was actively looking at killing the Indian, killing the Native American. And then there was the assimilation where it's kill the Indian but save the man, where people were sent to boarding school. They were given land allotment. And you take a Native American who lives from a different set of values, who views land completely different, and tell them that now this plot of land is yours. And I don't know if anyone meant to help them understand the idea of taxes, the idea of fences, where it caused some real painful time for Native people where they would have people come to them and they would give their land or sell their land for dollars because they didn't understand currency. They didn't understand, that position that settlers had, and they were coming from a completely different position.
So to continue what you were saying, not only in exchange for money, there was a story that I heard, and I don't remember which professional development course I heard this at, but there was a situation where there was a doctor in town that would provide medical services to Native Americans, and all they had to do was sign their name. And they thought, well, this was wonderful. I can get help, when I'm sick. And so kind of the message spread around that tribal group. And anyway, they would come in, ask for health care, and sign their name. And in the end, they didn't realize they were signing away their land to this individual, to his enrichment. And it was completely a matter of this doctor taking advantage of the situation.
These stories are hard to hear, and they are sometimes difficult to fathom. But when we listen to these stories, I think it is important for us to remember that we live in a time when we can make a difference, that we don't have to look at this and feel shame, but rather a feeling of how do we work together to, work to come together. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want our audience I want them to understand that it can be painful, but use that to help us to jump forward into something new and different and have that spirit of reciprocity somehow.
So we want to activate empathy, not guilt.
Yes.
We're not responsible for it. And so to go to guilt is counterproductive. But when we activate empathy, people will start asking, how can I help? What can I do? Some awful things happened, and we can make restitution now. We can make things better now. We can begin communicating and validating the feelings and honoring the stories and acknowledging the truth as part of their helping the Native people reclaim their history and their heritage.
I want to add something that happened that I thought was pretty hopeful because, we keep talking about these treaties and everything seems so old-timey. You're picturing these treaties in your mind. It's this old yellow parchment paper that's, burned around the edges. But last summer in 2020, the summer of 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that about half of the land in Oklahoma is actually on reservation. And that changed the jurisdiction for a lot of criminal and for court cases, both criminal and civil. And that was a really, really big deal because I believe it's the Cherokee tribe had negotiated with Oklahoma Territory. And then when Oklahoma became a state, they were like, okay, well, this is no longer in effect because you negotiated with the territory, but now it's a state. Well, the Cherokee brought it and it rose up in the courts and went to the Supreme Court, and they recognized that original treaty was, in fact, valid and still intact. And so now people in Oklahoma, and again, to say that land is Cherokee land, it's not saying that the Cherokee own every single thing that's on that land. It's like, I live in Utah County. My house is in Utah County. Utah County doesn't own my house, but my house is within Utah County, within that jurisdiction. It's a matter of jurisdiction and not ownership. But to me, that was really exciting that things can change. We can honor old agreements. I don't know, I just found it very hopeful in a subject where usually I'm cringing and like, oh, but like Cally said, there can be a lot of guilt. And so it was nice to have some hope.
I think there is something that everyone can do, which is maybe start the practice of land acknowledgement. The idea that where you're at, or if you're at a gathering, or if you're in school and in your classroom, that you can acknowledge that these are the ancestral lands of a group of people who were caretakers much further back than your ancestors were. And along with that agreement, I know that what I've tried to do now is to give my pledge to continue to be a thoughtful steward of that land. And I actually, when I do a land acknowledgement, I share what my family is going to do. We're going to pick up garbage, or we're going to donate to a program that helps with environmental consciousness. Or I may, in a land acknowledgement, say that I am contributing to a scholarship fund for people whose ancestors were once on this land.
Brenda, can you give us an example of a land acknowledgement?
So right now we are on BYU campus, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Ute, the Shoshone, the Paiute, and Goshute, and that I recognize that they were gentle and mindful stewards of the land, and through their example, I pledge that my family will also be thoughtful stewards, that we will be caretakers of this land. And especially when we go on walks or hikes, that we are going to carry a bag that we can pick up trash. And so that is my pledge. I also want to say that I recognize that there were many other tribes who came across this land hunting and gathering, and I acknowledge their presence also.
Thank you, Brenda. We've made an effort in the BYU Arts Partnership to make land acknowledgements whenever we can, so that we start creating awareness and activating empathy. And also it's a way that we can all learn the beautiful principles that the Native people have to teach us about caring for our land. Recently heard one of our BYU scientists describe, someone commented, we've learned so much about what we know about water in the last 200 years. And he said, oh no, we learned from the indigenous people. For what they've learned over thousands of years, they brought much to the conversation. And I think sometimes we need to remember how much of our world, our life, and our knowledge comes from thousands of years worth of indigenous study. So one of my questions that's still pending is, I don't really understand the difference between tribal land and a federally established reservation. And I don't really understand, how do Native people decide if they're living on the reservation or if they want to leave the reservation? What are some of the issues with living on a reservation, on or off?
Well, I grew up on a reservation. I grew up on the Navajo Nation, and when I went away to college, that was when I left the reservation. And so my understanding, and I will probably need the help of Stephanie and Heather, my understanding is a reservation is a land set aside through the recognition from the federal government that this is land that is under the jurisdiction of a tribal nation. And tribal lands are sometimes lands that have been bought back and also include reservation lands. Do any of you want to add to that? Like the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation, they have a small piece of tribal land, which is actually a cemetery, but they have bought back land, which is now tribal lands.
They've bought back their ancestral lands. So you have reservations, tribal land, and ancestral land. And sometimes those three things are the same thing, and sometimes they're different. So with the Shoshone, they have bought back their ancestral land, but they own it. It is not held in trust through the government. But that tiny little cemetery in northern Utah is, but that's not a reservation. But it is tribal
land.
So it does get a little bit complicated with all these different things. And some tribes don't have a reservation. So you don't necessarily have to have a reservation in order to be federally recognized.
There are some tribes, because of relocation by the federal government, where their ancestral lands may be in the southeast, but now their reservation or tribal lands are in the Midwest. You take the Trail of Tears, where they took thousands of Native Americans from the southeast and moved them into the Midwest onto reservations. Those would be, they have lost their ancestral lands, and now they have reservations that they live on because of government policies.
So one other thing to be aware of is that when it came to ancestral lands, many of us still have a very European-centric view of lands, like that it's, okay, here's the land border and this is where it ends. Ancestral lands for many Native Americans were very fluid. Many of them traveled, not all of them. And so often the borders, there's not really, it's hard to say this was their ancestral land, this was their ancestral land. Many of them crossed borders or crossed in that way. And so I think that's important to acknowledge. Also, it's challenging too for, like, I think of the San Juan Southern Paiute Indian tribe. They had a very challenging history because they were recognized, they had land, and then it was taken away. And then because it was more convenient for the government, they grouped them together with the Navajo Nation. So at this point, they still do not have their own land, and they still consider themselves very different from the Navajo Nation.
But I believe they're in negotiation with the Navajo Nation, who are planning on allotting them a portion that will be theirs, that they can have as their land.
I think they are in negotiation, but it's been a 20-year negotiation, and there are still some sticky points that need to be worked out. As far as the Southern Paiute, Navajo Mountain is the portion of that tribe whose land is in Utah. And so their tribal offices are actually in Tuba City, Arizona. Just like the Ute Mountain Ute, their tribal offices are in Toyac. And there is just one community from the Ute Mountain Ute that is part of Utah, which is the White Mesa community. And they, I think, are also, or maybe in the process of looking toward federal recognition.
What an incredible conversation today. This information could go on, and the three of you have studied this so in depth. Brenda has lived it her entire life, and we have a lot of information to share, and many people out there who have information to share with us, and we can't wait to meet you and get to know you as we continue on this journey with the Native American Curriculum Initiative. So is there anything else any of you would like to add to the conversation?
So I just wanted to share a quote in the research that I've been doing about the history of U.S. and tribal relations or Indian relations here in the United States. I came across this quote by President Nixon. It was the quote that he gave, it was the message he gave to Congress in July 1970, where they officially signaled the end of the policy of termination. And it was the beginning of the policy of self-determination. And these are his words. And I feel like they very much encompass how we feel about the work that we're doing. He said, "We must assure the Indian that he can assume control of his own life without being separated involuntarily from the tribal group. And we must make it clear that Indians can become independent of federal control without being cut off from federal concern and federal support." And I think that our work here is to hopefully support the other actions that make this possible. You know, there's things that happen at a government level, and we can have some small influence on that. But what we can control is that we can control our own feelings, our own thoughts, and our own actions. And igniting that empathy that we talked about earlier, I think is one of our main goals with this work right here. And first, it's knowledge. And so we hope that everyone will, all of the teachers or anyone else who listens to this podcast or is involved in this work will first become educated. And then second, through that education, that they will develop empathy and that our actions will then mirror the empathy that we feel.
Thank you for joining us today. We all want to move forward, learning and living artfully. There will be a video where Brenda and I demonstrate how we remember the 5 tribes and the 8 sovereign nations. There will also be a fact sheet and a link to the NACI online course. Artful Teaching is made possible by the BYU Arts Partnership in the McKay School of Education.
Thanks to James Houston for editing this podcast. Music was generously provided by Connor Chi, a Navajo Diné composer and performer.
And special thanks to all of the teachers who are changing lives every day while serving in schools.
If you like what you heard, please leave us a review. You can find all the show notes for this episode and more resources at advancingartsleadership.com.
And don't forget to check out our tribe-approved lesson plans on the website as well.
I'm Heather Francis.
And I'm Cally Flox.
And I'm Brenda Beyal.
Wishing you an artful journey.